Well, my name is Thomas Leonard. To give you guys a little bit of my background, just briefly, I started Modern Harvest Farms with my cousin. Both put in, I think, $2,000. So we didn't have a very big budget. We had to be really smart about how we used our time and our resources. But I've also managed some really big farms. In my bio, it talked about Oregon's Wild Harvest. It's like a 650-acre farm. I was the farm operations manager for Gaia Herbs, 350-acre property with a team of about 40 people. So every minute that we wasted added up, financially, as well as there's a lot to get done on the property that size, especially when you're hand weeding and doing everything organically. The presentation today really talks about, just one style of doing agroforestry, one style of establishing seedlings. There's lots of different ways to do it. I'm not saying this is the right way. This is just a way that I've found that's really efficient in terms of reducing your labor for planting and maintaining the site. So to give you some background on contour lines, I started contour lines with Sean Dixon Sullivan. He woofed at Modern Harvest Farms back in 2017, I guess. And then in 2018, he reached out to me and asked me to help him start a nonprofit. So we started with one pilot site, a demonstration site in Livingston, Guatemala. We invited three guys to help us install that site and plant the trees. The following season, we went to each one of those three workers' individual properties and planted trees with them. And they all invited a few friends. And we've scaled up from there. So at this point, we're working with over 17,000 farmers. I updated the tree count last week with Sean. We're at a solid 5.2 million trees right now, and we're still planting this season. So that number will go up from here. It's a really pretty incredible impact. And my role with Contour Lines now is replicating the same model in the United States. So this is what some of the projects look like in Guatemala. They're a little bit different from what you would see in the US. You can see on the top, there's some drone shots, and you can see all the rows of nitrogen fixing trees from above mixed in with fruit trees. Bottom left-hand corner, you see some site prep where we've planted live stakes of Gliricidium sepium, a native nitrogen fixing tree, and then interplanted some fruit trees along there and also piled up a lot of mulch. So this is essentially a soil conservation practice where it's really amazing. Some of these steep slopes, you'll see, this much black topsoil form behind these lines in as little as 18 months. On the bottom right-hand side, that's a more mature site. I think that's either Nelson or Jesus' site. You can see the diversity of trees and plants in there. They've got pineapples in the foreground. There's yucca in the background. Looks like a big mix of citrus orambutans and Gliricidium sepium on this site. So as I said, in the US, we're working right now to kind of mimic that same pattern. We started with a few pilot project sites. We've expanded from there. This year, we're wrapping up planting. I've got less than 10,000 trees left in a cooler here in Asheville, North Carolina, that will soon go out to the last few farms. So I'm really excited to get through that. We're putting in about 50,000 trees in the ground this season. These are essentially all demonstration sites. One of our objectives that we've set for ourselves in the US is to hit a lot of states, and we've done a pretty nice job, especially on the East Coast. There's a project almost 2 hours from any location that you drop on the map. So if a farmer is on the edge about putting in berms and swales on their property or planting with contour lines, there's an example not far from them. So this is the project that kind of started it all. This is my buddy Jackson Benefield. He called me when I was working at Gaia Herbs around 2020 and asked if I would come operate a mini excavator for him. I got there Friday evening around dark in October. We made a plan and we started flagging out areas where we wanted to excavate berms and swales. He had a problem there. He had too many animals and not enough land. Land's pretty expensive around Asheville, and he had like 30 birds, two cows, several goats, a few pigs, and about 1 acre of land. So he was realizing that, buying land was not an option. He needed to start planting more vertically and create more options for fodder, fruit, and nuts. We designed this site, excavated it, and came back. Contour Lines supported him, and we ordered about 500 trees, and we planted them on St. Patrick's Day the following spring. This went really, really well. We got all the 500 trees in the ground in just a couple hours. The decompaction we done with the excavator made planting really easy. I came back in June. We had this rye cover crop that had come up, and I terminated it. I just crimped all the rye and bent that cover crop back. And this did a really, really good job of suppressing the weeds. So I went to Europe and visited my sibling in Germany for a month. And when I got back, I was thinking like, oh man, it's the middle of summer. This was a waste of time. The weeds have probably grown up all around these trees. We've lost them. And I came back out there and I walked the entire property, looked at all 500 trees with Jackson. We hand weeded what we felt like we needed to weed. And that took about 20 minutes. We did this while we were drinking a beer. We looked at every single tree before we finished the beer. And that's when I realized, this is a really, really good system. We didn't have to weed whack at all. He doesn't even own a mower. Basically had a 100% survival rate. So we got 500 trees established, very little work. This is one of our first pilot sites. Before now, this was the largest site we had. I think now we've got a site in Kentucky that's going to be larger and an abandoned coal mine. This is Southern Appalachian Highland Conservancy. It's a land trust outside of Asheville. And we did a 17-acre silvopasture system with this organization. And we tracked the volunteer labor that went into this project. So if you see at the top, we planted 3,450 trees. And it took us about 116 hours of work to complete this task. You can see over on the right side, there's David and Andrew, two of the techs who've done the most projects for Contour Lines USA at the site a few months ago. And you can see the trees have gotten pretty tall. We had good survival. They're still very densely planted. But yeah, so this just kind of goes to show the advantages of this system, and it really creates a low cost and low effort way to get trees established. Credit this a lot to our community engagement model. Recently, for one of our partners, I put together not just the cost of what it costs contour lines to put in a tree. We're doing this typically for under $1 a tree. But I also calculated what the cost is to the farmer. So how much, if the farmer was paying themselves an hourly rate, what would that cost? We asked that the farmers house our technicians when we're doing site visits and cook them dinner so we're not having to go to Hunt's Brothers Pizza when we're in these rural communities and these food deserts. We don't need to add an extra hour to go get lunch. So we've asked for the farmer to share some of those costs. I actually incorporated all those things that really aren't any financial costs to the farmer. Opening up your tiny house or spare bedroom or cooking, sharing a meal, hopefully with stuff from your farm, with the technician, that still comes down to less than $2 per tree. Altogether, we're looking at about, under $3 per tree, including everybody's labor, to get these trees established. I also ran the numbers. This does include 2026's diversity. On average, we're seeing over 10 species planted per site. We let the farmers pick their species from our list. We see really good diversity on these sites. I'd say better than other reforestation projects. As I've said, we have a high seedling survival rate. This picture on the right is a site that I helped plant. I actually dug these swales and led a 4-H group planting these trees. And it pretty much, I don't think the farmer really did anything with the site at all. I think the field got bush hogged one time before this picture was taken. And you can see that the density and biodiversity in this site. David, who was in the last slide, he went around and monitored a bunch of our sites last year. He looked at me and goes, man, even the sites where people have kind of abandoned them, the trees still survive. So that's one thing that I think really adds a lot of credibility to the system, that the more you put into it, the better the sites look, and have some examples of that further on. So to get into more of the technical stuff, I always describe what we do is we provide trees and technical assistance to farmers in exchange for them implementing soil conservation practices. So we ask that they plant on contour. We recommend that they use berms and swales, they cover crop the site, and that they mulch the site. This is back to Jackson Benefield's property. This is in the 3rd year. You can see elderberries, bald cypress, American sycamore, there's mulberries, Kentucky coffee, black locust, and false indigo, probably some willows, all planted in the same row. And it's amazing. You go to his property and the birds just don't stop chirping, even in the middle, hottest part of the day. So a lot of people ask me, what is contour? What are contour lines? So essentially, we're planting our trees perpendicular to slope. And the idea is that we're trying to slow down water and let it sink into the ground. We had Hurricane Helene a couple years ago in Asheville, and we had about 20 inches of rainfall. I was at the Carolina Farm Stewardship Conference during their social hour, standing around with a few farmers from Western North Carolina. We had someone from Barnardsville, Old Fort. I live in Woodfin, just north of Asheville. I looked at Rocky and Olivia and I said, "How'd your swales do during Helene?" They had total devastation in their community. Tons of farms were wiped off the map. A lot of houses got washed away. And they look at me and they go, "Yeah, they filled up." I go, "Did they blow out? Do you have major problems?" Like, no, no, it seems like they just sunk all the water into the ground. I had two friends staying at my house here in Woodfin during the storm. They said similar things. I think there's maybe the bottom swale overflowed a little bit. And Mad said the same thing in Old Fort. So I did the math. 1 inch of rainfall is 27,000 gallons of water. So on my little almost 1 acre site, I trapped about 500,000 gallons of water, 500,000 gallons of water that didn't go down into the creek in my backyard, straight into the French Broad River and wipe out people's homes in Western North Carolina and Tennessee. So for me, that's a big thing. And especially with all the drought that we're experiencing right now, I think that storing water in your soil is a great move. This also does a lot for water quality. I've made a comment before that I think it's unethical to have animals if you're not capturing their manure before it goes into the waterways, and berms and swales are a great way to do that. The berm is the mound, the swale is the ditch. Here's an example. I really like planting the trees on the berms. I make this nice decompacted raised bed. A lot of people do their berms a little differently than what we do. I'm really just trying to create a really good raised bed for planting the trees. I want this decompacted soil where the roots can penetrate and the tree is going to grow really fast. The other big advantage to the berms and swales is the stale seed bed. I talked earlier about how we didn't really have to weed. We end up creating a really nice stale seed bed. I'll show you another example of that. Here's an example of what these projects look like. In the top left corner, we have a project in Mansfield, Ohio at the Richland Correctional Institute. So they have a garden there that they teach inmates different horticultural skills so that they're employable when they get out of prison. They built their beds off contour and they're bringing all this compost and stuff. And a lot of that washes away because their beds are parallel to slope. So all that soil washes into this creek. So we put a system of berms and swales underneath in between their raised beds and the creek. And as a result, we're catching any of that compost that might wash away and go into the creek. And so at the same time, we're fertilizing our trees, but we're also protecting the water quality downstream. The top right-hand corner, that's another area at Southern Appalachian Highland Conservancy. That's a U-pick food forest. You can see all the planting tubes in there. That's grafted apple trees, but we also have a bunch of nitrogen fixers and other native fruit trees and nut trees planted in between those tree tubes. So that's really densely planted. In the bottom, we've got a project in Ohio where Todd grew up in forested yard and he just wanted to have trees in his front yard instead of cutting the grass all the time. So they've got, I think, probably like 15 different species planted in that area and also affected the hydrology in their yard. And then the bottom right-hand corner, this is a site in Angier, North Carolina. This is Ken Haggerty. In the top left-hand corner of that picture, you see some parallel rows. Him and his son kind of followed Mark Shepard's model and planted a system of I think it was chestnuts, some nitrogen fixers, and apples. And they probably had like a 40% survival rate. We came in and provided some trees for them and helped them design these berms and swales. And Ken stood up in a class I was teaching at a conference and said he had 100% survival rate, which I'm sure isn't true, but it just shows you kind of an example where they probably had a little bit of the bucket effect where they dug these holes into this decompacted hard pan, and when it rained, all the water filled up those holes and drowned the trees. But when we create these nice raised beds, the trees don't drown. And they also did an amazing job of following all the other principles of mulching and cover cropping. Here's Kurash in Fredericksburg, Maryland, and David marking some lines. This is the tool that I typically use. Joe Belushi is on the call. He has a laser level and he loves using that. Also a great tool. I've measured the time it takes to use both tools, and It's really about the same amount of time. On a nice flat site, you can go a little faster at the laser level, I'd say. But on a steep slope, you have to move the tripod a lot, and that takes time. Here's a little slide from years ago. This just kind of shows that I'm digging my ditch and putting the soil on the downhill side. This year, I also did a project where we put it on the uphill side. And it looks like we're having really good results with that too. So shout outs to Alex Pellet and his project in Coney County, South Carolina. This really shows that stale seed bed that was on a previous slide. So what I'm doing here is when I start digging, I kind of scrape off all the topsoil, all the sod, all the roots and seed bank that might provide competition for our trees. And I put that at the bottom of my berm. And then I continue to dig down. Usually I'm digging down about 18 inches. As I get further down, I'm getting into the subsoil. That's this nice sterile medium. And I put that on top of the berm. So now when I plant my trees in the subsoil, I don't have a bunch of weeds popping up. So, this is definitely a form of tillage, I'd say, with the mini excavator. And there's other tools you can use, backhoes. A lot of people try to do it with like a bottom plow or different things, and you really don't see this amount of control and soil inversion. There's usually a lot of grass clumps, and it makes planting difficult when you're trying to cut through the roots. For me, this is what I really like. We also are doing a lot more projects now with even a wider bucket. So we're still going down about 18 inches, but we're using a 24-inch bucket for our silvopasture sites in areas that have really big alleyways. I always recommend that people rake out their berms afterwards. I really like this slide because it kind of shows the shape of our swale. The permaculture handbook talks about a nice 45-degree slope, but I can dig about 3 yards a minute with a pretty modest mini excavator. I find that the rental cost and the fuel cost is really minimal when you do it this way. These sides will kind of collapse and change over time. So over time, you'll get that shape. This is one of the most ingenuitive things for the year. This is Bryce and Kelly Parker at Junction City Farms in Virginia. And rather than using that hand rake like in my picture, he figured out how to hook up his tractor and rake out his beds. And I just went and saw this site delivering trees like about a month ago, and it looks awesome. He did a really good job. I also had another guy that zip tied a T-post onto the front bucket of a tractor and did a similar thing, and I think had pretty good results, definitely efficient results. That's Mateo down in Florida. So mulch is super important. On the left, we have Fertile Foods in Dripping Springs, Texas, and Desmond has all these juniper trees that they really kind of take over the property. So they've thinned them out to provide room for more biodiversity, and he's filled up his logs kind of like a hugelkultur bed into his swales, and then he actually puts wood chips on top of this. So it's pretty cool when you go over some of these. They're kind of like a trampoline. It's super soft and porous, and there's still tons of water holding capacity. He calls it his carbon rain battery. Just a cool way that someone's innovated on top of this. We also have a property in Blue Hill, Maine, Angela and Jonathan and their landmates property. They had a lot of brush and slash from an area they cleared out. So they actually filled their swales with some of these branches from the pine trees. Before they were just going to burn the material and kind of release it into the atmosphere, but now they're keeping that organic matter on their site. So in the last slide, I showed you what the swales look like in year one when we're raking them. This is kind of the projection. I don't have sites that are 10 years old, but this is kind of the trend that we're seeing by year three. Some of that side starts kind of sloughing off and collapsing a little bit. And if you're putting woody material in there, you get this really nice mix of kind of a compost bed, like a lasagna bed of grass clippings, manure, woody material, and soil. So I'm expecting a lot of these projects to kind of look like this lower area here in about 10 years. I also want to emphasize, especially in drier areas, that the saturation happens over time. You don't really see the full effects of these swales until a few years down the line, especially if you're in a more arid and dry region. Cover cropping is another one of these soil conservation practices that we ask everyone to do. This helps stabilize the soil, builds organic matter. I use a number of different species, and I usually hand broadcast the seed. Here's Joe Belushi's farm. He did a rye cover crop, and you can see it. This is right before he terminates it. So right as that rye is starting to produce pollen, he's going to come in there and cut it all back and release all of his trees. And we can also see where he's grazing his sheep up right to the side of the swale. I like rye because it produces a lot of biomass, but I also like things like clover and buckwheat, as you can see here on this slide, that don't grow very tall. This is a picture from Gaia Herbs. These are trees that are not planted on contour lines, but on a steep area that we didn't want to till. And the buckwheat formed a really nice cover crop. We didn't have to weed whack the trees that year, which we spent a lot of time and money doing it the year before. And then this is Kia Plummer in South Carolina at the bottom. This is an example of what happens if you do put a lot of time into your system. She's actually got a guy who comes and mows everything, and they've incorporated a lot of wildflowers into their cover crop mix. Andrew designed this site. It's definitely one of the more beautiful sites with all those flowers. Here's an example of terminating the rye cover crop. You can see some of that dry material in the bottom. You can see where I've done half of a line. The rye is that kind of blue plant, and you can see where it's been cut back. And the cool thing is this stuff will still be there like 10 months after you cut it back. So rather than buying straw, you can kind of just grow your own. After I terminate rye, always, it's important to reseed your cover crop at that point and fertilize or mulch more. But, like I said, fertilize or mulch because they are one and the same. We do provide a lot of mulch to retain moisture in the soil, but also provide fertility. The top right hand, you can see some black locust trees that I've removed some of the side branches to help get better fence posts and firewood. But I've also been able to cover the soil with it. And then Mansfield, Ohio, where we've used wood chips. I really recommend, and I'm really pushing towards this. If you have access to old straw, wet straw, putting that down right when you put down your cover crop seed, that really pays off and it keeps your seed from washing away. Every once in a while, I see a site where someone cover cropped and the seeds just washed away. And for using clover, it can be pretty expensive. And then this is Jesus down here in Guatemala. He's showing an example of free mulch where he's chop and dropping his Gliricidium sepium trees and using those to mulch around his fruit trees. And I love that green mulch because it's full of phosphorus, nitrogen, and a lot of those nutrients that the trees need. But then you also have this woody mulch that is fungal food and provides that mycelium network that connects all of the trees together. This is Debbie McCutcheon in Ohio. And they actually, these trees right here, these black locusts, I gave them, probably 12-inch, 16-inch bare root black locust. And they saw this is 6 months, 5 months after they planted. So they had amazing growth in their first year. I contributed that to them providing phosphorus in that year. They have 2 horses, a mini horse and a full size, and they mix wood chippings in for bedding with their manure. So they sprinkled that, you can see in this bottom picture, just a very light rate on their trees and saw great growth. And this really matches up with what we see from the Inga Foundation down in Honduras. They've done extensive research on fertilizing nitrogen fixing trees and found that they do need phosphorus to get photosynthesis rolling and to actually fix nitrogen. If you get down to what photosynthesis is, the ATP aminotriphosphate is phosphorus, and you got to have that to get your nitrogen. So I've talked a little bit about pruning support trees and showed some of these slides of where we cut back leaves and use branches and leaves as mulch, where we're kind of growing our own wood chips instead of paying for wood chips or importing wood chips. And this is really what, to me, makes our systems regenerative. We're not relying on nitrogen-based fertilizers that have a really big carbon footprint or importing even organic materials from other properties, but we're growing a lot of that on site. Down here, you can see a great example of a alley cropping project in Guatemala and a small seedling that I've put a bunch of black locust branches around. This is a slide that I've found really helpful as I've been giving this presentation. I took this from Syntropical Agroforestry. I don't know if Ernest actually made this slide or who made it. Does a good job of describing when to prune to maximize biomass production. So if you look in this top right corner, it kind of shows a growth curve where these trees are having really exponential growth when they're in vegetative state. But as they start flowering and fruiting, that growth slows down. The idea is that right when you start seeing flowers is the perfect time to prune any species if you're going for biomass, whether that's a grass or a support shrub like a false indigo or a nitrogen fixing tree like a black locust. A lot of the farmers we work with do that, and they, maybe pollard or coppice their trees, and they have different reasons. Maybe they're going for fodder, maybe they're going for mulch to prevent weeds from growing. Maybe they're just trying to establish shades so that things like pawpaws and oaks and some of these secondary succession species trees are able to get established on their property. It's a really bad idea to go out into a field and start planting oaks and pawpaws. You're going to not see a very high survival rate. Those trees need some shade. So by planting densely, we're able to provide some of that. I think this group probably knows about coppicing and pollarding, but I love this slide because it just shows a list of some of the species that coppice and pollard really well. This is a brand new slide I just put together this week. So this is my buddy Alex Pellet in South Carolina, and we planted these black locusts years ago. This is one of our first pilot projects. We planted about 200 black locusts on his property, and in December of 2024, he coppiced one of them back. And so you can see where he's making the chainsaw cut. That's where he cut this tree back to. On the right side is the regrowth from that same tree. So we had about 20 feet of growth in like 10 months from that coppice. So you can just see the amount of biomass production that we have on I think a 3-year-old, 4-year-old black locust tree. Now, people always criticize that are hesitant that we're planting our trees really close together, but I do this because I want the trees to exchange root exudates. I saw a great presentation. I love the idea. It was a professor and he was studying alley cropping, but he planted his nitrogen fixing trees 30 feet apart. And I'm like, yeah, that'll provide nitrogen in 20 years. I want my trees to share root exudates in year 1, year 2. So that's one of the reasons why we plant really densely, and we see really good growth patterns. I did a spacing trial at my personal farm, and I planted black locust mixed in with some fruit trees at 9 foot, 6 foot, 3 foot, and 1 foot spacings. In 18 months, by far my tallest trees were the trees that were a foot apart. Now, I include this slide because it's really important to understand that it's a big carbon footprint to produce nitrogen fertilizers, and it takes a lot of energy for plants to fix nitrogen as well. And now we're all familiar with this picture at the bottom of rotational grazing, and that when part of the top of the plant is chewed off or eaten or cut off, the roots die back in a similar proportion. Now, the same thing goes for nitrogen fixing trees. When you coppice a nitrogen fixing tree, those roots die back. And what they leave behind are all those little nodules of nitrogen for other trees to access, other plants to access. Like I said, it takes a lot of energy to produce that nitrogen, and they're not just giving it away for free. Pruning is also really important in order to release that nutrients for make it bioavailable. I made this a few years ago, and it shows we've got these little apple trees and they're starting to get shaded out, and they need a lot of sunlight to create all those sugars and produce that fruit. So we came in and we released that tree, as they say in the forestry world, and we cut back some of the branches so that that apple tree was in full sunlight. We dropped the branches around the apple tree to fertilize it. And as a result, the tree got bigger and produced more fruit. So that's essentially what we're going for with our systems and why we plant so many nitrogen fixing and support trees. Over time, the canopy trees, maybe we're planting chestnuts or hickories, pecan trees. Over time, that might be our climax tree that we're going for, or our 50-year plan. And that will shade out eventually all these nitrogen fixing trees, which are mostly pioneer species and shade intolerant. Here's an example of Jackson's property, and just showing where he's cut off some side branches to create better quality wood. And he's dropped that mulch all around the ground, and that has done a really good job of preventing any grasses and weeds from growing right there by his trees. If anyone on this call or you guys know of any farmers that are interested in planting trees with contour lines, we have a really simple application at this link. It's only a few questions. It takes minutes to fill out. We try to make that really accessible. There's no complicated forms or spreadsheets. We try to be respectful of everybody's time. So before this year, this was a limiting factor, was finding farmers to plant with. At this point, we finally kind of hit that inflection point where we probably have more applications than we have funds to plant trees. Yeah, please share our link with anyone in your network. So thank you guys for your time.